Is Amazon's series The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power a form of cultural appropriation? Now, I'm sure if we were looking at a picture of a European samurai instead of an African elf, I'm pretty sure this would be a fairly short conversation. And this isn't just colorblind casting on the part of Amazon, which itself would be pretty silly. They actually explicitly say that diversity is something that they're going for. One of the actors celebrated this, saying, "Finally in this show, kids are going to see people of color taking up space in the center of a fantasy series." Odd phrasing, as taking up space is usually a negative term. Now, let's be clear, I'm not saying that black people don't belong in fantasy in general. Far from it, as ethnic diversity is actually quite common in Orientalist fantasy, like Hammerfell in Elder Scrolls, which is one of their most popular settings in the series. This is fairly ironic, considering that Orientalism itself is one of the most famous examples of cultural appropriation. But I would argue it wasn't actually that harmful, as it wasn't erasing the people's culture. It was merely taking elements of other people's culture and integrating it into your own art. Europeans didn't replace other people's culture with their interpretation of their culture. That would be a lot more harmful, as they are actually erasing someone's culture. But that is arguably what is happening here with Amazon's Lord of the Rings series. Because it isn't racial appropriation, it's cultural appropriation, meaning someone can still appropriate someone else's culture even if they're a part of the same race. It isn't just about inserting diversity into a setting that doesn't have it, it's also about the perversion of certain concepts and themes of the series. There are many quotes of people who are working on the series showing that they are not really following Tolkien's intentions. Like here when they're talking about the orcs, they're saying that it was very important for them to treat them as their own culture and explore their world on their own two legs. They're also adding female orcs, which Tolkien has obviously said that yes, there are female orcs, and yes, they do have their own culture, but since they're supposed to be the incarnation of evil, from a literary standpoint, you don't want to show that. Touching on a similar theme, the director of the series has said that one of the ideas is how far into the darkness are you willing to go to do the right thing. While this is a common theme in storytelling, it is not one that Tolkien was a fan of. He had more of a straightforward good versus evil worldview. He believed that moral ambiguity is itself morally compromised, and that committing evil for a greater good is still evil. In fact, he argued that evil for the purpose of good is actually more harmful than just plain old evil. Because it's easy to rally people around your cause to fight a known villain, but if some good comes from the dark deeds of a supposed hero, then such evil would be widely celebrated. This in turn would corrupt society over time. It's an interesting perspective that you don't really see that much in media these days. As a moral nihilist, I'm not particularly a big fan of moral objectivism or subjectivism, but as someone who is intellectually curious, I do like seeing different ideas being represented in media, especially when they're well executed. However, my views aren't particularly relevant here, as I wouldn't want to change an established lore just to suit my politics or philosophy. I much rather create my own lore to have full creative control. But of course, Hollywood doesn't want to create new IP because they are not confident in their creative capacity. They also want easily marketable franchises that have an established audience, though neither of these really explain why they would want to change the lore, especially when they know it would anger fans, as can clearly be seen in their like-to-dislike ratio on their trailers. I would argue that this is because Hollywood and the people who are making these series have a fundamentally different culture to the properties that they're portraying. They really only see two things in literature: entertainment and ideology. That's it. They don't respect lore because it's just entertainment, bro. It doesn't actually matter. As long as it makes their brain go buzz, they're happy. And beyond that, the only thing that matters in art is ideology and the message you get across. They believe they have an ethical responsibility to deconstruct lore and subvert people's expectations. This is because lore is a form of culture, and culture is a social construct, and social constructs aren't real and are usually a form of oppression. How exactly? Well, they put pressure on individuals to conform to the norms of society, even if they're as simple as acknowledging that Tolkien's elves aren't African, as that would be exclusionary. Thus, anyone who opposes the subversion of lore is aiding in oppression. Now, let's be clear, not everyone who is in favor of diversity or changes to the lore consciously believe this, but it is the ideological roots of their belief. You also might be confused. Why would they want to destroy culture when they purport to defend minority culture? Isn't it hypocritical for them to deconstruct Tolkien while promoting minority racial identity? Well, no. Actually, this is perfectly consistent with their ideology. According to critical theory, which is basically Marxism applied to culture, only majority groups are capable of oppression, and harming such groups is just corrective action to level the playing field. They also don't intrinsically value minority culture or racial identity. They merely see it as useful in empowering oppressed groups in fighting their oppressors. They often paint over oppressive elements of minority cultures with less problematic interpretations. So, in other words, appropriation. The point here is that even though Tolkien's culture is subordinate to Hollywood's, it's still acceptable to appropriate it to reduce harm. If we were to adapt Tolkien faithfully, it would perpetuate the notion that fantasy is only for white people. You could also argue that despite being less dominant numerically than Hollywood, Tolkien's world is still part of the majority. This is because, according to critical theory, minority and majority have nothing to do with percentage of populations. Majority simply means that you're part of the oppressive group, and minority just means you're part of the oppressed group. Thus, since Tolkien's lore is oppressive, as it promotes white culture, it's part of the majority and should be deconstructed. So, is the Rings of Power cultural appropriation? Well, yes and no. The term itself is Marxist, and according to their rules, it isn't cultural appropriation because it's a good thing that it's being culturally appropriated. This kind of linguistic manipulation is quite common in their thinking, by the way. So no in the Marxian sense, but if you wanted to redefine the term to be more ideologically neutral, it would very clearly be so. Tolkien's lore is supposed to be an Anglo mythology, as Britain didn't really have much of a pagan mythos as the rest of Europe did. Casting non-Europeans in various roles is erasing the entire point of Tolkien's world. You can argue that that's a good thing, but you can't deny that that's what you're doing. One last thing before ending this video. People are speculating about how good or bad the series will be, but I actually hope that it's bad because the technical and mechanical quality of it doesn't really matter if the aesthetics and lore are perverted. And much like Tolkien's idea from earlier, if a perversion is poorly executed, then it would be widely discarded and ignored. But if it's well made or good, then it will be celebrated and thus spread like cancer. But that's my take on the matter. What do you think about the direction that they're taking? Do you think it's as irredeemable as I do, or do you think there's some silver lining to this? Let me know what you think in the comments. Thank you all for watching, and have a nice day.